Opening his eyes, John felt dizzy as he looked around at the blurry scene before him. All he could see was an enormous redwood tree piercing the sky, lost in the misty fog. The area around him was covered completely in the dense fog, with faint rays of light penetrating through in glimpses. That was the only way he could see his own body. John tried to remember what had happened before. He was asking to buy a beautiful Navajo blanket from a Native American woman. The blanket captivated him with its intricate geometric designs, woven in the colors and patterns typical of Navajo textiles. He was certain he had never seen such an exquisite red blanket in his life. The soft, silky fabric shone like water droplets, its vibrant and lustrous red hue unlike any other. The detailed embroidery told a heart-wrenching tale of tragic romance that compelled John to acquire it no matter the cost. He recalled speaking with the elderly native woman, likely in her late 60s, her weathered face creased with lines. As they talked, she chewed steadily on something red and juicy dripping from her mouth. John was certain it wasn't the betel nut that people on the mainland chewed at weddings and celebrations. No, it was the meat of some animal, though he couldn't guess what creature it came from. He only knew the revolting stench that emanated from the woman as they negotiated over the blanket, a horrific smell that would repel anyone from going near her, and originating from the rotten flesh in her mouth. If John hadn't been so enthralled by the blanket hanging outside her home, he certainly could not have endured in her presence for as long as he did. By then it was late evening, and the dozens others from John's hiking group had already left this remote village to begin the trek back to Santa Fe. Yet he lingered, separating from his companions over his fixation on the blanket. If he didn't catch up to them soon, he would have to spend the night alone in his tent at the roadside. But his desire for the red blanket outweighed his impatience. He patiently followed behind the elderly native woman as dusk fell over the desolate hillside. During the day, it was an idyllic scene of lush green terraced fields and pockets of fragrant pine forest echoing with birdsong. At night, an eerie, ominous stillness settled over the remote landscape. The woman's solitary cabin stood alone on the barren hill, accessible only by a faint footpath cutting through the cornfields. So rarely traveled it was nearly invisible as a trail. The area was so isolated, there wasn't even a single electric light. John entered the woman's small cabin, no larger than 150 square feet. He had never seen one so tiny before, with tall poles extending 10 feet up around it, decorated with dangling charms and textiles in vibrant colors. From the moment he came here, John sensed an unsettling aura. The cabin sat atop a lonely hill, surrounded by dense cornfields. The narrow footpath was the only access, ending right at the native woman's home. The corn grew so tall and thick around it. From a distance, the house was fully obscured. If it hadn't been for John's thirst for adventure, breaking from his group to follow a tempting footpath on a whim to see where it led for the entire day, he would not have found himself here, nor would he have seen the captivating red blanket that had caught his heart. The path stretched on for hours until John felt as though he had entered a different world entirely, unlike the one he knew. "Ma'am," John called out loudly, trying to get the native woman's attention. The pitch-black darkness enveloped him once inside the cabin, and he could no longer see a thing. After waiting in vain for a response, he grew impatient and considered turning back toward the doorway to grab his flashlight from his motorcycle and shine it inside. But as soon as he turned, his eyes were met with a pair of huge, round, red eyes in the blackness. A shadowy face, the stench wafting up. John cried out in shock, but only managed that single exclamation before his mind went blank and he lost awareness. When John awoke, he found himself alone in the misty environment, wrapped in the blanket. Examining himself, the vivid red blanket from the native woman lay over him. Touching his head, a sharp pain seemed to pierce through his skull. But his scalp was smooth when he felt it, no bumps or swelling, as if the agonizing sensation was only an illusion. Unsteady, John got to his feet, admiring the blanket despite his discomfort. After all, he had finally obtained it just as he wished. He caressed the soft red cloth, stroking it gently and holding it to his face. It brought such smooth satisfaction, unlike any ordinary rough blanket. Its supple texture was like a woman's bosom, the touch of youthful flesh against his skin. John clutched the blanket, inspecting it closely. It was about 6 feet long by 2 feet wide, the fabric incredibly fine, beyond any modern textile technology. Its delicate scent was faintly floral like a young maiden, stirring John's heart. After breathing it in for a while, John suddenly remembered he had to get back to the town of Santa Fe urgently. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. When he had blacked out, it was nightfall. Now the scenery around him had some faint light, meaning at least one full night had passed while he was out. The fog obscured his vision. All John had with him was his empty backpack with some dried rations. He chose a direction at random, hoping to get out of the mist and find a trail to lead him back to civilization. At first, John felt no hint of worry or fear. With the unshakable confidence of impulsive youth, he firmly believed there was no place that did not have a way out. He had fainted and found himself here, meaning the native woman must have brought him to this spot. Therefore, there must be some path by which she was able to get back. The only thing that puzzled John was why the native woman had rendered him unconscious and left him in this place, even laying the red blanket he wanted to buy over him. It showed she was concerned about the cold climate here and wanted to provide the blanket to keep John warm, but he had no idea why she would do such a thing. The last image John saw was her terrifying wide eyes and foul mouth overflowing with some vile red liquid. That horrifying face had appeared right before John blacked out, and he guessed it surely belonged to the native woman he had asked to purchase the red blanket from earlier. But as John continued on, it seemed he had stumbled into a deep, dark forest. The fog was dissipating, and he realized he had arrived in a hellish place not meant for the world of men, but only for the world of devils. A viscous pool of dark crimson blood congealed into a long, slimy streak. It looked like the trail left behind by some creature. John's foot touched the revolting fluid, and he felt utterly disgusted. What was this, he wondered. John stuffed the blanket in his backpack and hurriedly pulled his foot back from the filthy red puddle. Walking further, the surroundings slowly started to transform. Horrific sights John had never witnessed before began to emerge. Hidden behind the vast expanse of fog was now an enormous, monstrous castle. What sickened John the most, threatening to make him retch, was that this structure was built entirely from human bones, ghastly white bones. Where was this place? Hadn't he just been inside a small cabin at the end of a footpath? Where had that old native woman flung him to this extreme point of no return? Which way could lead him back to the world he knew? John tried to restrain his revulsion and continued forward. He scrutinized the castle of bones, slowly reaching out to touch one section. Oddly, as soon as his fingers made contact, that piece instantly crumbled into a pile of dusty fragments, as if the bone had remained here for endless years. Next, like a row of dominoes, the entire massive structure of the bone castle disintegrated directly into powdery debris, clouds of dust billowing up. Just one gentle touch from John's hand had utterly destroyed the colossal edifice. He could not believe what his eyes had just witnessed. He rubbed them vigorously for a moment, then seemed to snap out of a stupor, because somehow he found himself back at the old cabin atop the hill, the red blanket still clutched in his hands. His motorcycle was still parked nearby, as if everything that had transpired was merely an illusion. John wondered what had happened. Bewildered, he glanced around, only to find the repulsive old native woman's house had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Just like the bone castle he had demolished. It had clearly been right before his eyes, yet in the end it had not been real. So where had the old woman's cabin disappeared to? And she as well. It definitely could not have been his imagination, because the evidence was still right here, plain as day. The red blanket was still in his grasp. After searching a while longer and finding no other inconsistencies, John finally had to shake his head and conclude the bizarre events he had experienced must have been just a figment of his imagination. His backpack still hung off the motorcycle seat, the headlight beam pointing down the hill blanketed in cornfields. John got on his bike and headed back down the old road to reach the highway, returning to the town of Santa Fe. As soon as he reached the highway, a large motorcycle came roaring past, then abruptly stopped and turned around, pulling up next to John. A female voice called out, "John, where have you been? You had the whole group worried sick looking for you everywhere." Peering closer, John recognized it was Lily, the youngest member of their current hiking group. He laughed and said, "Oh, I saw an interesting little path and had to explore where it led. Sorry to make everyone fret, Let's head back now." Though slightly puzzled, Lily nodded. She drove off ahead to lead the way. The county seat of Santa Fe, New Mexico was the administrative center closest to the Mexican border in the state, with many pristine scenic areas rarely visited by tourists. John's hiking group this time consisted of 12 people total, all planning to meet up in Santa Fe town after exploring the whole county. They would have a final dinner together before heading back to visit the Fort Duncan Tunnel complex, then concluding their 2-week southwest sightseeing trip to return to Dallas. It took another half hour before John and Lily were less than 10 miles outside Santa Fe town. They reunited with the rest of the hiking group on a remote bend of the highway known for its many blind spots. Over the years, more than a few accidents had occurred here due to limited visibility. The group leader on this trip was Tim, a young archaeology PhD candidate. Aside from his archaeology passion, Tim also loved adventuring to famous landmarks and scenic areas. Hearing John had gone missing, Tim had earlier dispatched 4 others to search for any trace of him. Lily had been the 5th sent out and finally managed to locate John. Seeing John return, Tim let out a sigh of relief. He said, "I was afraid you had died out there somewhere. Where on earth did you disappear to?" John scratched his head sheepishly, then seemed to remember something. "Everyone, take a look at what I found," he said, pulling out the red blanket to show Tim, Lily, and the other 8 members here. Seeing John produce a glossy, shimmering red blanket, Lily was immediately drawn to it. "Oh, how beautiful!" she exclaimed. "Where did you get this?" Standing next to Lily, Tim just kept frowning deeply, as if lost in thought about something. Asked about the blanket's origins, John readily told the full story. "It's quite odd. I found it in a tribal woman's house at the very end of the footpath I took. But strangely, right after taking hold of this blanket, I fainted unconscious. When I awoke, her house had vanished without a trace, and I found myself lying in the middle of the road." Finishing his account, everyone laughed, assuming John was joking to scare them. Tim alone said nothing about it. He just remained silent briefly before commenting, "There are still 4 others who went back to search for you. We need to wait for them before we can continue on. They probably won't make it back tonight, so let's find a nice open area nearby to set up camp for the night." John scratched his head sheepishly and said, "I'm sorry everyone had to suffer because of me. Otherwise, we could have all been sleeping cozily in a motel tonight." Tim said nothing, just turned and went to scout a place to set up camp. Seeing this, Lily turned to encourage John. "Oh, don't worry, John. When we go hiking together, the most important thing is supporting each other in times like this. You have nothing to feel bad about." Lily winked playfully at John with her sweet charm, then suddenly pointed at the red blanket he was holding and said, "Could you lend that to me for a bit? I just love how gorgeous it looks." John blanked out for a moment before realizing what Lily meant. He nodded and smiled. "Sure, go ahead and borrow it. Just remember to give it back to me later. I'll go help Tim set up camp." John grabbed his camping gear off the motorcycle seat and headed in the direction Tim had gone, looking for a spot to make camp for the night. At this remote bend in the road, there was a very spacious open field, right by the edge of a deep, yawning ravine. The clearing stretched over 300 feet wide, perfect for their entire group to pitch tents and camp overnight. Although there were warning signs posted about this area's history of car accidents and danger, adventure seekers routinely ignored them. They continued to choose this picturesque spot as a place to rest and camp, mostly because the scenery was so stunning. Far off across the road on the horizon was a cascading waterfall, white and foaming, pouring into the lush green depths of the gorge below. On the cliffsides by the waterfall, the sparkling clear night sky was filled with bright stars, the moon gleaming across the valley to create an extremely breathtaking vista. Moreover, despite the caution about the spot's hazards and history of vehicular accidents, they had all been cars plunging down the ravine. Never any cases of loss of human life in this open field itself. As such, thrill seekers felt safe camping here indefinitely. Lily hugged the red blanket tightly to her face, closing her eyes and relishing its feel. She absolutely adored this blanket. She thought it over, then suddenly got the idea to try and buy it off John. Once John and Tim finished setting up camp, Lily sidled up close to John and whispered in his ear, "John, this blanket is so beautiful. Would you let me keep it? Name your price. I'll pay anything." John looked at Lily and laughed. You're joking around. This blanket isn't anything that special. Lily stopped smiling. She stated firmly and decisively, John, I'm serious. I really love this blanket. Can you sell it to me? John was slightly taken aback. He hadn't expected Lily to really think that. But if Lily liked the blanket, John was also quite fond of it himself. He had to go through a lot of trouble to obtain it. At least in that imagined scenario, that was true. John had never considered selling the blanket to anyone, but now Lily directly asking to buy it put him in an awkward spot. Just as he was hesitating, unsure how to respond, the loud roar of a motorcycle engine rang out. A middle-aged, bearded man with shaggy hair rounded the bend on the deserted road. As soon as those in the hiking group caught sight of him, they knew right away who it was. It was Hank, the first person Tim had dispatched to search for John. Seeing John had returned, his bike parked in the open field, Hank heaved a sigh of relief. Dismounting his ride, he came over to John and scolded playfully, "Kid, you had me circling this highway back and forth dozens of times. No cell signal. I was afraid you died out there somewhere." Hearing Hank guffawing, John scratched his head and smiled. "Sorry, I made everyone worry so much." Hank waved his hand, dismissing the apology as unnecessary. "Don't treat me like an outsider." Then Hank suddenly noticed Lily clutching the red blanket tightly. Puzzled, he asked, "Lily, what are you doing hugging that blanket so tightly? Where'd you get it from anyway? I've never seen it before. Let me take a look." Hank reached toward Lily, abruptly wanting to borrow the blanket. Lily froze up momentarily, but shyly held out the blanket to Hank. As she handed it over, she felt a tinge of reluctance. John explained, "It's because of this blanket that I got everyone caught up in this mess. I found it off a footpath in a tribal woman's house." Taking the blanket from Lily's hands, Hank nodded and cajoled, "Yeah, this blanket really is gorgeous. I've never cared much for frivolous, flashy stuff like this, especially bedding. But damn, this blanket is just too beautiful. My wife would love it back home. Hey kid, why not leave it for me?" As soon as Hank took the blanket, he kept stroking and caressing it, marveling at how unbelievably smooth and silky the fabric was. Meanwhile, Lily panicked, hurriedly explaining over and over to make sure Hank wouldn't take her cherished blanket. Hank, I already asked John to sell me that blanket first. You can't have it." Hank stroked the blanket in his hands, enjoying its feel even more the longer he touched it. He clicked his tongue and said, "Oh dear, but it still belongs to John right now. He can sell it to whoever he wants. Your home isn't lacking in nice bedding and fabrics. Women always have so much stuff. Come on, let me get this for my wife to use. John's a single guy. He probably doesn't need it anyway, since it's so flashy." Seeing the two tussling back and forth over it, John laughed helplessly, not knowing what to say. After waiting a while longer, the other three people dispatched to search for John also returned. Following the same tire tracks as Hank, they had just gotten back and were immediately drawn in by the blanket's allure. It was like some kind of sorcery. In the end, no one managed to forcibly buy or snatch the blanket, and John did not agree to sell it either. Everyone was resentful, returning to their own tent still sulking and refusing to speak to each other. Tim was the group leader and had to step in multiple times to smooth things over before the situation calmed down. Still, there were sideways glances thrown between them full of irritation. Most of all, everyone's gaze lingered longingly on the red blanket in John's hands. The starry night stretched boundlessly across the mountain range, the sweeping scenery gloriously beautiful. But at this time, most of the group no longer had the mood to appreciate the stunning sights of their hike. It seemed all their mental states had changed drastically ever since the red blanket appeared. It was the crux of every problem. That night turned out to be a long, grueling night, and also a night soaked in horrifying bloodshed. After hastily eating dinner, everyone retreated back to their own private tents. Some snuck over to John's tent, demanding to secretly negotiate buying the blanket in order to get a leg up on the others. Greedy, calculating minds began to emerge, and John at the center always had to bear the brunt of it. The one who came looking was Tony, a young engineer 2 years John's junior. Right after hurriedly eating dinner, Tony had snuck over from his own tent to John's to talk. Tony sat at the opening of the tent, asking John to lend him the red blanket because he felt cold. Tony was only 24 this year, unmarried and still a bachelor. Tony always hoped to find someone to be his lifelong companion. When Tony touched the red blanket, he constantly felt as if he was stroking a woman's bare skin, barely able to resist the temptation. It was as if this blanket alone could provide him a warm body to cuddle with at night, fully satisfying his desire for companionship. Hence, Tony's greatest wish at this moment was to be able to purchase the blanket from John's hands. Tony was utterly infatuated with the blanket. Tony wrapped the blanket around himself, constantly caressing and stroking it. At first he maintained a polite conversation with John in response, but eventually Tony became utterly engrossed in fondling the blanket, as if seducing a woman, no longer paying any mind to John at all. Seeing Tony clinging possessively to the blanket, even getting ready to return to his own tent with it, John spoke up, demanding it back. "All right, if you're heading back, could I have that blanket returned, please?" Lost in a stupor over the blanket like a mindless fool, Tony was jolted back to awareness. He seemed a little ashamed but still reluctant, asking, "Or how about you let me borrow it just for tonight? I'll bring it back to you tomorrow morning, okay?" John laughed and said, "You're joking. Come on, hand that blanket over so I can get some sleep." Tony refused with a defiant tone, making John's face burn red with anger as he got up to snatch it back. The two were polite at first, but John soon lost his patience and began yelling at Tony. Their quarrel drew the attention of the whole group. Khan was the first to rush over, seeing Tony wresting the blanket from John's grip. He shouted angrily, "Tony, let go of that blanket and give it back to John. What do you think you're doing, you thief?" Tony yelled shrilly, "I only asked to borrow it for one night, and he wouldn't even let me do that much." Then he started shouting and cursing at me. "I absolutely won't give it back. Let's see what he can do about it." John also shouted back furiously, "You piece of shit. I was polite with you so many damn times, but you just won't get it. If you don't know shame, then I'll beat some into you." John charged forward and punched Tony full force on the head. Furious, Tony threw the blanket aside and charged at John, the two exchanging blows. The group descended into chaos, some shouting encouragement, others jumping in to break it up. With the house on fire, the rats came scurrying out, and it was no surprise for thieves to appear. After the brawl ended, John and Tony gradually calmed down and made peace. But when John returned to his tent, he found the red blanket had vanished. He asked around everywhere, but no one admitted taking it. Tony had just been punched, and certainly wasn't the one who took it, leaving John resentful that someone had stolen it from under his nose. Those in the group started becoming suspicious of each other, especially those who had wanted to buy the blanket from John before were even more upset, turning on each other. First, Hank went to Lily and said, "Lily, tell the truth. You took advantage of John and Tony fighting to sneak off with the blanket, didn't you? You were the one who liked that blanket most. It couldn't have been anyone but you." The woman in Lily flared up. She retorted sarcastically, "Hank, how could you say that? Accusing me of being a thief. I think you're clearly the one who did it. Look at you, all scruffy and shaggy. You look just like a burglar. You're a big, strong man. Amidst their tussle, you snatched the blanket away, right? Tell the truth. Don't wrongly accuse others when you're the one who stole it." Hank's ears bulged furiously. He had always hated when people said he looked like a thief. There was nothing to be done about his natural build. You couldn't judge someone's character based on their looks. Yet Lily had called him a thief, even saying he resembled a robber. That stung Hank even more, like pouring oil on fire. "Slap!" Hank charged forward, grabbing Lily's hair and slapping her viciously, knocking her to the ground with blood dripping down her face. At the same time, Khan stomped around the camp, searching for any trace of the red blanket but couldn't find it. Enraged, he turned and shouted at John, "John, you hid that blanket yourself so no one else could buy it, right? That's a really shitty thing to do, turning us all against each other suspecting theft. I've searched everyone's tent except yours. It must be in there." Hearing Khan say this, John was already upset about losing the blanket. He immediately flew into a mad rage, rushing to grab Khan's neck and punching him over and over, screaming, "You piece of shit! If I still had that damn blanket, why would I say any of that? It was mine. I could sell or not sell it to whoever I wanted. What business of yours was it that I had to hide it? Seeing the group descend into chaos over a mere blanket, Tim, as group leader, once again had to intervene in each skirmish. First was Hank and Lily's spat. He had to break that one up fast, since Hank had beaten Lily until she was bloody and battered, hair askew. Next was John's turn, who had also punched Con unconscious. Tim mediated well into midnight before things finally settled down somewhat. Everyone was resentful, crawling back into their tents to sleep. But things did not end there. Exactly at midnight, a terrifying raspy scream ripped through the air like someone's throat gurgling up water. Everyone shot awake to see Lily emerging from Hank's tent, her face covered in blood. Clutching the red blanket tightly in hand, she shrieked, "It was him! I found it in his tent. The bastard deserved to die that way." Lily looked around wildly, then seemed to fear someone might snatch the blanket from her. She jumped on a motorcycle and raced off into the night with the red blanket. Tony and Con simultaneously yelled, "Holy shit! That bitch just killed someone and stole the blanket to make her getaway. We have to chase her down and get it back." Then they both hopped on their bikes to pursue Lily down the highway. The rest of the group was stunned by Hank's horrific death and Lily's feral, violent reaction over such a small conflict. No one could have imagined so many things happening all because of a mere blanket. Entering Hank's tent, they saw his throat slashed wide open, blood pooling everywhere. His shaggy beard was matted with the bloody vomit he had choked up in his final moments. Hank's terrified eyes stared vacantly, clearly shocked that sweet Lily could have done such a thing to him. And it wasn't over yet. Shortly after they dragged Hank's body from the tent, hoping there might still be a chance to save him, a loud explosion rang out, snatching everyone's attention that direction. Across the bend, through the gap in the cliffside curve, they saw a motorcycle engulfed in raging flames. A person was flung from the bike, plummeting into the depths of the valley below. Moments later, lights appeared once more down the highway bend. Con approached on his motorcycle, exhausted and disheveled but clutching the red blanket tightly. He parked and stood his bike off to the side, then strode toward the campsite. Halting in the middle of the road, he loudly announced his victory to the others. He declared, "That bitch forced Tony off the cliff to his death. I chased her forever before finally getting the blanket back, but she got away. She won't escape prison time for this." Con finished, extremely satisfied, dramatically flourishing the blanket before casually proceeding toward the field. But right then, speeding downhill around the curve, a large delivery truck suddenly appeared, moving far too quickly for the night road. Beep! The blaring truck horn drew out, the driver horrified and slamming the brakes, but too late. Con's body was smashed under the wheels, his head popping like a melon as it was crushed beneath the truck, completely unrecognizable. Everyone reeled in horror at the lightning-fast tragedy. It happened mere meters from the warning sign about accidents. The red blanket was flung to the side, just half a meter from Con's mangled corpse under the truck wheels. Bone-chilling screams and wails echoed through the night, striking utter dread into every heart. The blaring truck horn wouldn't stop, the driver himself paralyzed by the shock of someone standing in the middle of the deserted highway at night. He had driven quickly in the empty darkness, never expecting to cause an accident like this.